In 1955, a German-born rocket engineer stood in a Walt Disney television studio and walked roughly 40 million Americans through their future in space. He was charming, brilliant, and beloved. Within a few years, he would be one of the most famous scientists in the country, the man NASA trusted to build the rocket that would carry human beings to the moon. His name was Wernher von Braun. What those viewers were not told was the other half of his file. A decade earlier, von Braun had not been an American hero. He had been an officer in the SS. The rockets that built his reputation had been assembled underground by concentration camp prisoners who were worked to death by the thousands. And to bring him, and more than 1,600 other Germans, into the United States, his new government had done something quietly extraordinary. It had gone into their records and rewritten them. Men that America's own investigators had flagged as dangerous Nazis were reissued clean. One file says it all. In 1945, U.S. Army intelligence described one of von Braun's key colleagues as, quote, 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat. A short time later, after the right hands had been through it, the official dossier on that same man concluded there was, quote, nothing in his records indicating that he was a war criminal or an ardent Nazi or otherwise objectionable. Same man, same war, two completely different files. The difference was a program with a deliberately forgettable name, Operation Paperclip. This is the story of how the United States won the space race partly by importing the people who built Hitler's wonder weapons, and how it buried what it knew in order to do it. To understand what was being covered up, you have to start in the tunnel. The weapon at the center of this story was the V-2, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, and a genuine technological leap. On the 3rd of October 1942, a V-2 reached the edge of space, the first object human beings had ever sent that high. The man directing its development, from a secret base on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde, was Wernher von Braun. But a rocket that can touch space can also be aimed at a city, and that was the point. Nazi Germany built the V-2 to terrorize London and Antwerp. Around 9,000 people were killed by V-2 attacks during the war. Here is the fact that almost never survives into the hero's version. After British bombers raided Peenemünde in 1943, the Germans moved V-2 production underground into a tunnel complex called the Mittelwerk, and they built it with slave labor. The workers came from a concentration camp called Mittelbau-Dora. They dug the tunnels, assembled the rockets, and died doing it, from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and execution. The estimates are staggering. Roughly 12,000 prisoners died building the V-2. More people died making this rocket than were ever killed by it as a weapon. Von Braun was not a camp guard, and he did not run the prison. But he was not a bystander either. He held the rank of major in the SS. He later admitted visiting the Mittelwerk many times and called the conditions there, his word, repulsive. By his own account, by 1944, he understood that prisoners were dying. Some former prisoners said he was directly involved in the cruelty. His defenders say those accounts confuse him with someone else, and that point remains disputed. What is not disputed is simpler and damning enough. The most celebrated rocket engineer of the 20th century knew his machines were being built by dying slaves, and he kept building them. When Germany collapsed, men like von Braun were holding something every great power suddenly wanted. The only question was who would reach them first. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was finished, and its rocket team knew it. Von Braun and his closest engineers made a cold calculation. They did not want to be captured by the Soviets, closing in from the east. They wanted the Americans. On the 2nd of May, 1945, von Braun's brother Magnus rode a bicycle toward a line of American soldiers and delivered one of the strangest sentences of the entire war. Quote, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." They surrendered not as defeated enemies, but as a prize, and American officers knew exactly what they had: the most advanced rocket program on Earth, intact and willing to change sides. The US had also seized the Mittelwerk itself and quietly shipped enough hardware out of those tunnels to rebuild dozens of V2s back home, before the site was handed to the Soviets under the post-war carve-up. In the summer of 1945, the military formalized it. A program called Operation Overcast was created to bring German specialists to America. Months later, it was renamed to something blander, easier to forget: Operation Paperclip, after the paperclips clipped to the files of the men they most wanted to keep. The logic was the entire Cold War in one sentence: better that these men work for us than for the Russians. The Soviets were thinking the very same thing and would soon haul off thousands of German specialists of their own. It was a race, and the prizes were people. There was only one problem. America had rules about who it was allowed to let in, and by those rules, a great many of these men did not qualify. On paper, the United States had a clear line. President Truman's policy was explicit. The program could not bring in anyone who had been an ardent Nazi or a war criminal. That should have disqualified a serious number of the men on America's wish list. Men who joined the party early, wore the SS uniform, or ran operations that ran on slave labor. So the people running Paperclip did something about the paper. The agency in charge, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, went through the scientists' security files and rewrote them. References to Nazi Party membership were trimmed. SS ranks were softened or deleted. Damning intelligence reports were swapped for reassuring ones. The men were not cleared because they were innocent. They were cleared because their records had been edited until they looked innocent. Return to that colleague of von Braun's from the start. The operations director for V2 production, a man named Arthur Rudolph. In 1945, a U.S. military assessment of him was blunt. Quote, 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat, suggest internment. That is what the people who actually examined him concluded. But Rudolph was useful. So his dossier was reworked, and the official version that carried him into America stated there was, quote, nothing in his records indicating that he was a war criminal or an ardent Nazi, or otherwise objectionable. Nothing objectionable about a man his own government had, weeks earlier, called a 100% Nazi who ought to be interned. This was not a clerical slip. It was the method. And for decades, the documents that proved it sat classified, out of public reach. The only reason we can set those two files side by side today is that a reporter named Linda Hunt spent years digging through the declassified records in the 1980s and refused to let it stay buried. And the men being laundered were not only rocket engineers. Some of them were doctors. Operation Paperclip is remembered as a rocket story because the rockets ended in something glorious: the moon. But the same program, using the same methods, brought over men whose expertise came from somewhere much darker than an engineering lab. Consider Hubertus Strughold. In America, he was celebrated as the father of space medicine. A great deal of the early understanding of how a human body could survive spaceflight runs back through him. For years, there was a prestigious award in his name, and a place reserved for him in the Space Hall of Fame. What the honors left out was where some of that knowledge of the body under extreme stress had come from. Strughold was tied to the Nazi aviation medicine world, a field that, during the war, ran human experiments on concentration camp prisoners. People were frozen, deprived of oxygen, and pushed through low-pressure tests that killed them, all in the name of aviation research. Strughold always denied personal wrongdoing. But the questions never went away, and decades later, the institutions finally caught up. He was quietly removed from the Space Hall of Fame in 2006. The award bearing his name was retired in 2012, after a newspaper investigation laid out his wartime ties. He was not alone. Other physicians connected to the Nazi human experiment programs, men like Kurt Blom, who had worked on experiments at the Ravensbrück camp, were pursued, protected, or shielded by American intelligence in those same years. The reasoning never changed. Their knowledge was useful, and the Cold War was coming. That is the part of Paperclip that should stay with you. It was not a one-time deal with a handful of brilliant engineers. It was a policy, a decision made over and over again, that what these men knew was worth more than what they had done. And then America gave them the one thing the cover-up was really there to protect: a future. The men of Operation Paperclip did not slip into America and vanish. They were handed careers, clearances, laboratories, and in time, fame. Von Braun's rise is the clearest case. He started at Fort Bliss, Texas, rebuilding V-2s for the Army. He moved to Redstone Arsenal in Alabama and led the team behind the rocket that launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, in 1958. When the United States built NASA, von Braun became one of its central figures, directing the Marshall Space Flight Center and serving as the chief architect of the Saturn V, the enormous rocket that carried Apollo 11 to the moon in July of 1969. Along the way, he became a star. He wrote and hosted television specials. He stood beside Walt Disney and explained spaceflight to the nation. His Disney film on space reached an audience of around 40 million. And in 1969, the same government that had once flagged his colleagues as security threats pinned its Distinguished Service Medal on von Braun. Sit with the full shape of that. A man who had been a major in the SS, whose early rockets had been built by dying prisoners, was now an American television personality, a NASA director, and a national hero, while the records that held the other half of the story stayed sealed in government archives. None of this erases what he built. The Saturn V is one of the great engineering achievements in human history, and the moon landing was real. That is exactly what makes it so uncomfortable. America did not reach the moon in spite of looking away from these men's pasts. To a real degree, it reached the moon by looking away. Which leaves the question the whole program was designed to avoid. When the truth finally surfaced, did anyone actually answer for any of it? The honest answer is, almost no one. Of the more than 1,600 Germans brought over under Paperclip, exactly one was ever tried for wartime crimes. A Mittelwerk manager named Georg Ricke, sent back to Germany for the Dora war crimes trial in 1947. He was acquitted. Not a single Paperclip scientist was ever found guilty of anything, in America or in Germany. The closest thing to a reckoning came nearly 40 years later, and it was quiet. In 1984, Arthur Rudolph, the man whose file had been changed from 100% Nazi to nothing objectionable, was confronted by U.S. investigators with the evidence of his role in the slave labor at the Mittelwerk. Rather than fight it in court, he renounced his American citizenship and left. After a career helping put America on the moon, he simply handed back the passport and went home to Germany. The rest, for the most part, lived out comfortable American lives. Von Braun died in 1977, a celebrated man. The honors stripped from people like Strughold came decades after they were already gone. What endures isn't a verdict, it's the paper. Because a few people, the reporter Linda Hunt, later the author Annie Jacobson, and the archivists who finally declassified the files, refused to let the rewritten records be the last word, we can now hold both versions at once. The man who was a security threat, and the same man who was nothing objectionable. The hero and the SS Major. The moon rocket and the tunnel. America made a choice, in secret, that the future was worth more than the truth about the men who would build it. It got the future. We are still living in it. The truth just took a little longer to come out from under the paperclip. This is Buried Records, where the stories history forgot finally get told. If this one was worth uncovering, there's another already waiting. Subscribe and be here when we dig it up.